They called it the $1 Million Challenge. A ruthless black stallion no rider could last more than seconds on, and a wealthy ranch owner who promised a fortune to the first soul who tamed him. 29 men had tried. 29 had failed. But when a broken veteran with nothing left to lose walked through the ranch gates, everything changed. Because he wasn't there for the money. And what happened when he met the horse would shake an entire community and the heart of the woman who thought she couldn't be surprised anymore. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The town of Esperanza, Texas, sat out on the western plains like a stubborn relic refusing to vanish despite the punishing heat, the dust storms, and the lure of modern highways that carried most travelers right past it. Population just over 3,000, Esperanza wasn't the sort of place you put on a postcard. The sun baked the land until even the mesquite trees looked thirsty, and the wind carried a constant veil of grit that worked its way into every crevice of homes, boots, and skin. Most folks made their living the same way their grandparents had, ranching cattle, raising horses, working rodeos, or supplying the bigger spreads that dominated the region. There were a few mechanics who fixed the trucks and horse trailers, a feed store with a faded Coca-Cola sign, a diner where the waitress knew every customer's coffee order before they sat down. Esperanza had the tired rhythm of a place that never truly slept, but never fully woke either. On Main Street, neon signs from a pair of chain fast food restaurants clashed with the weathered storefronts of boot shops and a bar called Dusty's, where country music leaked out of the swinging doors every night. Cowboys leaned on rails outside smoking and bragging about rides that had thrown them and bruises they wore like badges of honor. The rodeo arena sat at the edge of town, a low ring of bleachers and steel panels, the kind of place that lit up the desert sky with floodlights on Saturday nights when broncs bucked and bulls twisted under the lights. Esperanza was neither rich nor famous, but it was proud. And lately, it was buzzing with a fever that no rodeo or county fair had ever managed to stir. That fever had a name: Midnight. 10 miles north of town sprawled the Mallory Ranch, one of the largest operations in the region. Thousands of acres stretched across rolling pastures and sun-bleached ridges with white-fenced paddocks near the main house, and long lines of steel barns gleaming in the sunlight. The Mallory brand had been stamped into Texas horseflesh for generations, producing racers, rodeo stars, and cattle horses that carried the family reputation across the state. At the center of it all was Victoria Mallory. She had inherited the ranch after the sudden death of her husband, and she ran it with a combination of business acumen and sheer iron will that had earned her the nickname, the Ice Queen of Texas. The papers loved her features, and glossy magazines showed her in pressed jeans and silk blouses, standing beside prize-winning horses with the kind of cool smile that gave nothing away. Investors admired her decisiveness. Cowboys feared her sharp tongue. No one pitied her. She had never allowed it. The ranch house itself looked more like a modern fortress than a family home. Glass windows stretched 2 stories high, steel beams framed wide verandas, and the offices inside were outfitted with computers tracking horse bloodlines and financial markets alike. Yet behind all that modern sheen, the ranch pulsed with tradition, dust, sweat, the smell of hay, the crack of hooves on packed dirt. And then there was Midnight. The stallion was the ranch's dark jewel, a towering black horse standing 17 hands high. His coat gleamed like polished obsidian beneath the sun, muscles rolling beneath his hide with the raw power of a creature never meant to be owned. Midnight wasn't just a horse. He was a legend, or perhaps a curse. Every ranch hand had a story. Every cowboy in Texas had heard the whispers. Midnight could not be ridden. Midnight could not be broken. Midnight was the devil himself, wrapped in black hide. Reporters called him The million-dollar devil horse. After months of failed attempts and growing curiosity, Victoria made her move. One blistering afternoon, standing before the cameras of a local news station and the curious eyes of ranch hands, she laid down a challenge that spread like wildfire across Texas. Her words were clipped and deliberate, the way they always were, when she meant business. Any man or woman who can ride midnight 3 full laps around the corral will walk away with $1 million in cash. No tricks, no excuses. 3 laps. That's all it takes. She held up the check herself, a neat rectangle of paper with more zeros than most ranchers saw in a lifetime. The declaration hit the evening news. By the next morning, it was on talk radio, then YouTube, then TikTok. The rules were simple. Anyone could try so long as they signed the liability waiver. Whatever happened inside the corral was on them. Midnight had already sent men to the hospital. Victoria wasn't about to take responsibility for more broken bones. The money was staggering, but it wasn't just the money. Pride was on the line. To be the one who conquered the devil horse would mean fame across the West, maybe across the country. Rodeo contracts, endorsements, the kind of name recognition most cowboys only dreamed about. Within hours, hashtags bloomed across Twitter, $million devil. Sports bloggers picked it up. ESPN sent a crew, and regional news stations jockeyed for interviews. By the weekend, the Mallory Ranch was surrounded by trucks, trailers, and crowds of spectators eager to watch fools try their luck. Victoria stood on her steel veranda's sunglasses, reflecting the chaos below her arms, folded as though daring the entire world to step up. And step up they did. The first was a bronc rider from Oklahoma with championship buckles to his name. He lasted 3 seconds before Midnight launched him skyward like a rag doll. His wrist snapped on impact with the dirt, and the crowd sucked in its breath. The second was a Mexican vaquero, old school and wiry, who came armed with ropes and spurs. Midnight met his aggression with fury, slamming against the corral panels until steel groaned and men scattered for safety. The rider barely scrambled out alive. One after another, they tried rodeo champions, horse trainers, hotshot influencers, hoping to film a viral stunt. Some swaggered in with bravado, some whispered prayers, some tried sugar cubes and soft voices. Midnight met every attempt with the same result: violent rejection. There were terrifying moments. A young cowboy, barely 20 years old, was thrown so high that his shoulders shattered on landing. He had to be airlifted to Lubbock. Another man tried blindfolding the horse, thinking it would calm him, only to find himself trampled in a storm of hooves when Midnight panicked. By the end of the month, the record stood at 29 attempts, 29 failures. Newspapers gleefully kept count. ESPN ran a segment titled, "The Horse No One Can Ride." Local memes showed cowboys flying through the air like rag dolls, captions daring who's next. The Mallory Ranch Corral had become a stage, and Midnight was the undefeated champion. The town itself was transformed. Hotels filled to bursting, charging triple rates. Dusty's bar was louder than ever, its walls shaking with laughter wagers, and the arguments of men convinced they could succeed where others had failed. Vendors on Main Street sold T-shirts emblazoned with Midnight's silhouette and the words Devil Horse 29 and 0. Cartoonists plastered cowboy caricatures onto posters showing stick figures being catapulted into the air. YouTube channels uploaded compilation reels of each failed attempt, some set to dramatic music, others to slapstick sound effects. TikTok danced with clips of men flying hashtags, mocking and admiring in equal measure. The Ice Queen herself, Victoria Mallory, became the subject of endless debate. Some said she was cruel, exploiting desperate men for entertainment. Others praised her for turning the eyes of the nation back to Esperanza, giving the small town an economy boost no politician had ever managed. And through it all, midnight remained untouched, unbroken, untamed. Around the bar tables and under the scorching sun, men spoke in low voices of pride and honor. It wasn't just about the $1 million anymore. For the modern cowboy, riding midnight had become the ultimate test of manhood, the final frontier of a tradition that refused to die. Esperanza had become a carnival, a coliseum, a place where the Old West and the New World collided. And every whisper, every bet, every pair of eyes looked to the horizon, wondering the same thing: who would be the 30th rider? The Texas sun was relentless that afternoon, a burning disk, lowering toward the horizon, yet still fierce enough to sear the skin and bleach the grass to brittle stalks. The air shimmered above the dry pastures, and a coppery haze settled over the Mallory Ranch like a veil. The day's excitement had finally ebbed. The reporters with their bulky cameras had packed up, and the last cluster of curious townsfolk had driven back toward Esperanza. The arena was empty, the dust finally allowed to settle after the latest futile attempt. From the wide veranda of the ranch house, Victoria Mallory stood with a glass of iced tea in her hand, condensation beading on the sides and dripping onto her knuckles. She sipped absently, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. The arena below lay silent now, but she could still hear the echoes, the thud of a rider hitting dirt, and the collective gasp from onlookers, the paramedics rushing in. 29 men had tried. 29 had failed. There was pride in her posture as always, shoulders square, chin lifted, but fatigue clung to her in ways she wouldn't admit aloud. She was tired of cameras, tired of gawking faces waiting for blood, tired of wondering if this whole $1 million challenge had become less of a trial and more of a carnival sideshow. Was she truly proving a point, or just feeding the hunger of people desperate for spectacle? The thought tugged at her, though she would never speak it. To Esperanza, to Texas, to the world, she remained the Ice Queen of Texas. And the Ice Queen did not doubt, did not falter. She was still turning the thought in her mind when she noticed a movement at the far end of the road. A figure emerged through the rising dust, slow and deliberate. At first, she thought it was another reporter arriving late, or maybe a drifter hoping for a job. But as the shape came into view, she saw a man on horseback, though not the way the others had arrived. The horse was no sleek, trailer-kept stallion polished for show. This one was an old mare, her coat a weary gray, mottled with dust ribs faintly visible beneath her hide. The saddle creaked with every step, leather cracked and patched. The rider sat tall, but his presence was muted nothing of the brash swagger that had marked the others. Daniel Hayes. She didn't know the name yet, but she recognized the difference instantly. The man was lean, long-limbed, sun-browned from years outdoors. His jeans were worn pale at the knees, his shirt bleached, nearly colorless, his boots scuffed. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his face. But when he came close enough, she caught a glimpse of jaw, set firm lines etched deep from both age and hardship, and eyes that moved constantly scanning, as though reading the land itself. He carried himself with an economy of motion that stirred something familiar in her memory. Military, she thought. He walked like a man trained never to waste energy, never to let his guard down. He reached the front of the ranch and dismounted with quiet ease, patting the neck of the tired mare, before looping her reins loosely over the hitching post. He didn't look up at the house, didn't glance around to see who might be watching. No entourage, no film crew, no swagger. Just a man and a horse wrapped in silence. From her vantage point, Victoria studied him, her curiosity sharpening. He wasn't like the others. Every cowboy who had arrived before had come with noise trucks, rumbling boots, stomping laughter too loud to mask fear. They'd strutted, they'd boasted, they'd promised the crowd that this would be the day midnight was broken. But this man carried no promises, no bravado, just a stillness that unsettled her almost more than their noise had. Another fool, she thought at first, lifting her glass to her lips. But then her eyes narrowed. His back was too straight, his movements too precise. His gaze swept the corrals and barns, not like a tourist, but like a tactician cataloging exits, distances, possibilities. "A soldier," she murmured under her breath. And then, with a flicker of unease, or something close enough, the man paused, finally looking up toward the veranda. Their eyes met. Even at that distance, Victoria felt the weight of his gaze, measured, calm, and unflinching. Not a challenge, not submission. Just steady. For reasons she couldn't explain, she set down her glass and walked to the edge of the railing. He approached slowly, boots crunching on the gravel. When he stood below the veranda steps, he tipped his hat and spoke with a voice low and even carrying just enough to reach her ears. "Ma'am." The single word was polite, nothing more. He waited silent, as if the next move was hers. Victoria let the pause hang before she descended the steps. The last rays of sunlight streaked the sky behind her, outlining her figure in gold, but her voice when she spoke was sharp and cool. 30 men have tried," she said. "Every one of them failed. A few left with broken bones. One nearly didn't walk again. Do you think you'll be any different?" The man removed his hat. His face was fully revealed now, deep tan hair peppered with gray lines of fatigue and quiet endurance cut into his skin. His eyes, dark and tired, carried something beyond bravado. They looked like eyes that had seen too much. "I don't know if I'll be different," he said simply. His tone was calm, steady, without hesitation. "But I don't think that horse needs to be conquered. He needs to be understood." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Victoria blinked her composure, faltering for the first time in days. She had heard it all. "I'll break him in 5 seconds flat. I'll ride him until he kneels. I'll show Texas who's boss." But never this. Never understood. Her lips thinned, and she tried to recover her edge. "This isn't a game," she said. "That horse has sent men to the hospital. It could kill you." The man's eyes didn't waver. "I've been places where every day could have been my last. A horse doesn't scare me. And I don't want to beat him. I just want to try speaking his language." For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant clatter of wind against barn siding. Victoria studied him, every instinct telling her to dismiss him as another fool. Yet something kept her still. His voice wasn't cocky, wasn't reckless. It carried the heaviness of someone who'd already lived through the worst. Someone who no longer needed to prove anything. He stood waiting, hat in hand, with the old mare shifting her weight behind him. The light caught the faint scar at his temple, the rigid line of his jaw. She searched his face for arrogance, for bravado, for fear. She found none. Only quiet resolve. At last she spoke. Her voice softened, though, only slightly. "You can sleep in the guest house," she said. "Tomorrow morning I'll let you meet midnight." The man inclined his head, an almost military nod of acknowledgement. "Thank you, ma'am." He turned back to his horse, untying the reins, leading her toward the barn, with the same gentle patience he had promised the stallion. Victoria watched him go, her expression unreadable. But inside, curiosity stirred like an ember in dry grass. This man, she thought. Perhaps he isn't like the others. She lifted her glass once more, though the ice had long since melted, and stood there until the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Texas sky in shades of crimson. The dawn broke clear and pale over Mallory Ranch, painting the sky with strokes of lavender and gold. The desert air still held a fragile coolness, though everyone knew it wouldn't last. By noon, the heat would rise like a hammer, flattening the land under its weight. For now, though, the morning belonged to the quiet, the kind of quiet that carried birdsong and the shuffle of hooves in distant paddocks and the faint, comforting bitterness of coffee brewing in the ranch kitchen. Daniel Hayes was already awake. He stepped out of the small guest house with a steaming tin mug of black coffee in one hand and something glinting silver in the other, a harmonica scarred from years of use. He walked without hurry boots, crunching lightly on gravel, and came to rest by the weathered fence that enclosed the main corral. He stood there with the relaxed bearing of someone who had seen mornings in 100 different places. Mountains in Afghanistan, desert outposts, nameless stretches of road. This morning was no different, quiet, deliberate, unshaken. Inside the corral, the great black stallion stood apart as if carved from stone. Midnight. His mane tumbled like a curtain of shadow across his neck, his body taut with muscle and tension. He was watching even in stillness, the whites of his eyes flashing as he tossed his head once sharply, as though to remind the world of who he was. From the veranda above, Victoria Mallory watched as well. She had risen early, dressed in fitted jeans and a crisp shirt, her hair tied back neatly. She carried herself as always, with disciplined precision, a composure that masked the restless churn inside. When she stepped out onto the veranda and saw Daniel at the fence, her eyes narrowed. There he was, the stranger who had come the night before, on a tired old mare. No entourage, no swagger, just silence and the faint smell of dust. He leaned on the fence rail as though he belonged there, sipping his coffee, gaze calm and steady on the horse that had broken 29 men. Victoria's voice cut across the quiet like a blade. "Do you know what you're standing in front of?" she asked. Her tone was cool, matter-of-fact, but there was an edge beneath it. That horse has shattered bones, broken ribs, crushed a man's chest. One bad toss and you're finished. Daniel didn't look up at her immediately. He set his coffee down on the top rail, letting the steam drift upward. Only then did he tilt his head toward her. "I know," he said, voice low, almost conversational. "I've seen worse." The simple confidence unsettled her. She leaned forward, her hands tightening on the veranda railing. "Worse," she repeated. "Don't fool yourself. Midnight isn't just mean, he's smart. He remembers every face, every hand that's tried to master him. And he doesn't forgive." At that, Daniel gave the smallest of nods, as though acknowledging a truth he respected. "That makes two of us," he said quietly. For a moment, she frowned, not sure whether he was jesting or confessing. But there was no humor in his eyes, only a tempered steadiness that felt older than his years. Victoria straightened her instinct to keep her distance intact. Still, curiosity prickled at her. This man wasn't reckless like the others. He hadn't strutted or promised victory. He was just there, calm as a stone in the river, immovable. She stayed on the veranda, but she didn't walk away. Daniel turned back toward the corral. Midnight snorted, pawing at the dirt, once sending up a small puff of dust. The stallion's ears flicked forward, then back again, a restless rhythm. Daniel lifted the harmonica in his hand. The metal gleamed dull in the morning light, worn smooth where his fingers had pressed it 1,000 times. He brought it to his lips, and a note unfurled into the air. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, but then it deepened into a tune, slow, haunting, threaded with a sadness that seemed to come from some faraway place. The melody carried on the breeze, slipping across the fence, weaving between the dust motes that spun in the sunlight. Victoria stiffened. Music, that was his idea. She almost scoffed, almost turned back inside. But then she caught herself listening. There was something in that sound, something that did not belong on a ranch corral in Texas. It was the sound of distance, of nights far from home, of loss carried in silence. Midnight's ears twitched. The great black stallion stilled nostrils flaring as though scenting something new. His head tilted, muscles easing just slightly. For once he did not toss his head or rear in defiance. He simply stood listening. The notes shifted, flowing into a deeper line, lingering on long breaths. Like a voice speaking in a language without words, Daniel's eyes stayed on the horse, his own face unreadable, focused only on the flow of sound. The stallion took one step forward, then another. Dust lifted in small puffs beneath his hooves. He came no closer than 10 yards, but for Midnight, that was a lifetime of distance crossed. Victoria felt her breath catch. She whispered without meaning to, "No one. No one's ever made him come forward without a whip or rope." Her words were carried away on the wind, but Daniel heard them. He lowered the harmonica at last, letting the final note fade into the morning. He didn't smile exactly, but there was a gentleness in his eyes when he spoke. "I'm not in a hurry," he said. His voice carried easily to where she stood. "Trust isn't something you take. It's something that has to be given. Chosen." Victoria frowned, defensive, against the strange tug she felt in her chest. "And you think a song can change instinct?" Daniel slipped the harmonica into his pocket. "Not instinct," he answered. He lifted his gaze back to Midnight, who was still watching him with ears pricked, breathing steady. Memory. Horses remember. They remember every hand that's hurt them, every cruelty. That's what you're seeing when he fights. He's not born a demon. He was made into one. He let the words hang before adding quieter. But memory can change too if someone's patient enough. He finally looked up at her, then his eyes steady, carrying the weight of more than horses. "I've seen it before. In men, in children, in places most folks couldn't even find on a map. Eyes that knew only fear, only suspicion. You wait long enough, treat them like they matter. They remember something different. They remember how to trust." Victoria's throat tightened. For an instant, she forgot. Midnight forgot the challenge, forgot the cameras that had haunted her life for weeks. She only saw a man whose words weren't about horses at all. Silence fell again, thick with more meaning than either wanted to acknowledge. Midnight stamped a hoof, breaking the moment. He tossed his head once, but did not back away. His dark eyes locked on Daniel, curious, uncertain. Then he huffed a long breath through flared nostrils and held his ground. Daniel inclined his head, the gesture almost like a bow. "That's enough for today," he murmured. He bent to pick up his coffee again, took a sip, and turned to leave the fence line. Behind him, the stallion remained, ears forward, gaze following. For once, he did not whirl away in fury. He simply watched the retreating man as though puzzled by the sudden absence of music. Victoria stood frozen on the veranda, her pulse unsteady. She had seen countless attempts to master that horse force, fear, even bribery. None had brought Midnight even a step closer. And now this stranger, this weary soldier, had coaxed him forward with nothing but patience and song. She drew a long breath and whispered to herself almost unwillingly, maybe this time is different. The sun had not yet cleared the horizon when Daniel Hayes appeared at the corral. Each morning, he was there steady as the dawn, with a steaming mug of black coffee in one hand and his battered silver harmonica tucked in the other. The ritual never varied. He would sit quietly on the fence rail or lean against a post, saying nothing, not calling out, not shaking a bucket of grain or rattling a rope. He simply existed in Midnight's world, as though waiting for the horse to decide whether his presence was acceptable. On the first day, the stallion kept his distance, nostrils flared, pacing the far end of the pen, with a restless energy that vibrated through the air. But Daniel didn't press. He sipped his coffee, watched the light climb the sky, and let a few soft notes drift from his harmonica. The song was low, nearly mournful, carrying with it an echo of places far away. Midnight's ears flicked, head lifting. He didn't come closer, but he didn't charge the fence either. On the second day, the same scene unfolded. And the third. By the end of the week, the stallion had inched closer. 10 yards became 5, 5 became 3 drawn. Not by force, but by the unchanging presence of the man who never asked, never demanded, only waited. By the second week, the ranch had fallen into its own rhythm around this ritual. Hands arriving for work would glance toward the corral, shake their heads, and mutter about the crazy stranger who courted death with nothing more than patience and coffee. Yet more often than not, they lingered for a few minutes, watching in silence as midnight edged nearer. Even the most skeptical among them admitted the horse was different, less violent, less restless, as though the music and stillness had bled some of the rage from his blood. The ranch had seen plenty of routines over the years, but none as steady, none as strange, and none as magnetic. The small victories came slowly, each one harder earned than a buckle in the rodeo. One morning, Daniel brought a handful of oats. He didn't offer them right away, only set them near the fence, and leaned back, harmonica cradled in his hands. Midnight approached cautiously, hooves striking the dirt with deliberate weight. He sniffed the oat's ears flicking, then retreated with a toss of his head. The next day he lingered longer. On the third, he stretched out his neck and ate, one eye still locked on the man, standing perfectly still. By the fourth day, Daniel offered his palm flat oats resting in the center. Midnight hesitated, muscles tense, before finally dipping his muzzle to the hand. His warm breath brushed Daniel's skin, and for the first time, the horse fed from him directly. There was no whip, no spurs, no rope, just patience. The next milestone came harder. Daniel extended a hand slowly toward the stallion's muzzle. Midnight jerked back violently, a sharp snort tearing from his throat, hooves striking the dirt in a warning kick. Dust rose, but Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't scold, didn't retreat. He simply lowered his hand and remained where he was. Days passed. Each attempt ended the same way, Midnight shying, stamping, rolling the whites of his eyes. Until one evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Daniel tried again. His palm hovered steady, waiting. Midnight froze, ears twitching, and then hesitant, almost uncertain. He allowed the hand to brush against the velvet of his muzzle. It lasted a heartbeat, then the stallion pulled back, shaking his mane, as though startled by his own surrender. The ranch fell silent in awe. A horse that had been untouchable for years had permitted contact. A sliver of trust had been given. Not long after Daniel brought a brush, he didn't hide it or sneak it past. He held it openly, letting Midnight see, letting him choose. The stallion snorted, eyed it warily, even tossed his head in protest the first few times. But the man persisted in his quiet way, offering it again and again until Midnight stepped close, sniffed the wood and bristles, and finally, miraculously, stood still. Daniel ran the brush down the stallion's neck, slow and gentle, until the black coat gleamed, under the late morning sun. The sound of the brush moving through midnight's mane was soft, almost soothing. The horse is breathing deep into his body, relaxing beneath the touch. For the first time in memory, he accepted not just the presence of a human, but the intimacy of care. For the men and women watching from the rail, it was like seeing a ghost made flesh. Midnight, the devil horse, the undefeated terror of the corral, stood under the brush of a stranger's hand and did not resist. Victoria Mallory had told herself she wasn't interested, that she was too busy, that this stranger's methods were nothing more than theatrics. But each morning, she found herself at the veranda, coffee cup in hand, eyes drawn again and again to the corral. At first, she stayed distant, a silent observer, her skepticism armor thick. Yet each day she lingered longer. Some mornings, she came down to the fence itself, leaning casually as if she had business nearby. Other times, she simply stood with her arms folded, trying to convince herself she was there to supervise. But she wasn't supervising. She was watching. Watching the way Daniel moved, never hurried, never harsh. Watching the way he respected the horse's boundaries, never forcing, never deceiving. Watching the impossible become possible, one grain of trust at a time. In her mind, she couldn't help but measure him against the others. The rodeo cowboys had swaggered, cracked jokes, picked fights with each other in the dust before mounting up. They had spoken of victory, of breaking, of bending the beast to their will. They had all ended in dirt and humiliation. Daniel was different. He didn't want to conquer. He wanted to connect. And as she watched him day after day, something unexpected stirred within her, not just curiosity, but a kind of peace she hadn't known in years. His patience was contagious, his calm disarming. Against her better judgment, she began to wait for those mornings. It was in the quiet moments after training that they began to speak. At first, just brief exchanges over mugs of coffee at the kitchen table or in the cool shade of the veranda. She asked where he'd learned to handle horses. He deflected with a shrug, saying only, "Life teaches if you pay attention." But as the days stretched on, the words grew longer. One morning, as the harmonica's last notes faded into the breeze, Victoria found herself asking, almost despite herself, "Why here? Why this horse? What made you come?" Daniel took a long sip of coffee before answering. "I wasn't looking for a prize. I just saw something in him. Something familiar." "Familiar," he nodded. "Men can break bones, leave scars, but the worst wounds don't show. I saw that in his eyes. I've seen it before." She didn't press, not then. But later over dinner in the ranch kitchen, he told her pieces of his past. How he had once commanded men in a desert half a world away. How he had watched friends die in his arms, unable to stop the blood. How his wife and daughter had perished in a house fire while he was oceans away, fighting a war that left him nothing but ghosts. He spoke quietly without drama, his gaze fixed on the table as though reciting facts. Yet the grief beneath each word was unmistakable. Victoria sat across from him, her hands still her throat tight. She had spent years burying her own history beneath steel and ice, pretending it hadn't marked her. Now listening to him, she felt the weight of her own memories pressing forward. "My husband," she said at last, her voice thin but steady. "He made me feel small, even here in my own home. To everyone else, I was the powerful Mrs. Mallory. But in this house," she swallowed. "Control, words that cut. A cage I couldn't see but felt every hour of every day. When he died, I should have felt free. Instead, I felt ashamed. Ashamed I had endured it so long. Ashamed that people knew and said nothing." Daniel's gaze lifted, meeting hers across the small table. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he nodded, once slow and deliberate. "You survived," he said. That's not weakness. That's strength." His voice was rough but steady, carrying the weight of conviction. She let the words sink in, and for the first time in years, the ice around her heart shifted. The conversations continued, not every day, not always heavy. Sometimes they spoke of smaller things, the way the land looked under storm clouds, the smell of leather after rain, the stubborn quirks of the old mare he had ridden in on. But whether heavy or light, their talks carried a weight of honesty she hadn't known before. And in the silences between their words, there was no discomfort. Just the quiet understanding of two people who knew what it meant to hurt and what it meant to endure. She looked forward to mornings now, to evenings where conversations stretched longer than intended. She found herself smiling, genuine smiles, rare as rain in Texas, at some dry remark of his. Daniel, too, seemed different. Lines of weariness still marked him, but once in a while. When she laughed unexpectedly, he laughed too. A quiet, cautious laugh, as if remembering how. One evening, as the sun bled crimson across the horizon, Daniel stood brushing Midnight's mane, the stallion relaxed under his hand. Victoria lingered beside the fence, closer than ever before her eyes on the scene. And in that fading light, she realized it wasn't only the horse that was changing. It was her. The harmony that had settled over Mallory Ranch in those weeks did not last unchallenged. Peace, after all, has a way of attracting storms. The first sign of thunder came in the form of Jake Turner. Jake had once been a name in Texas rodeo circles, a local celebrity who wore his belt buckles like armor and carried himself with a kind of swagger that only came from mounting broncs and walking away in one piece. He had the looks, the charm, the Instagram followers. He had been a semi-finalist at the national circuit, the kind of cowboy Esperanza was proud to claim. And then Midnight had humiliated him. It had happened 6 months earlier during the first wave of challengers. Jake had ridden into the corral under the roar of the crowd, his hat tipped low, a grin wide across his face. He lasted barely 4 seconds before the black demon beneath him bucked with such violent precision that Jake sailed sideways, slamming into the fence. The crack of ribs had been audible even over the gasps. 2 weeks in the hospital and a season lost. The internet had not been kind. Memes proliferated, clips replayed his fall in slow motion, remixed with laugh tracks. Texas hero crashes, one headline mocked. Others were worse. Jake Turner's reputation, so carefully built, collapsed into a punchline. And he blamed everyone. He blamed Victoria Mallory for staging the circus. He blamed Midnight for humiliating him. But most of all, he hated the silence that had followed. Fame had been fickle, the spotlight gone cold. And now hearing that a nobody, some worn-down veteran with no name, was being given the kind of trust and patience Victoria had never extended to others, that was too much. So one morning, Jake Turner rode up to the ranch gates with 2 of his buddies trailing behind him. They didn't hide their intent. Boots slammed heavy on gravel spurs, jingling loud as they strode toward the corral, where Daniel Hayes sat quietly on the fence rail, harmonica in hand. The scene was typical for Daniel's morning's coffee mug, balanced near his boots, the harmonica pressed to his lips, notes drifting in a low, melancholy tune that seemed stitched from longing and loss. Midnight stood near his massive body, calm, stretching his neck toward Daniel's open palm where oats lay waiting. The stallion had learned the ritual. He came when called by no voice, but by the unchanging presence of the man who asked nothing of him but time. Jake arrived just in time to see Midnight lean forward and take the oats. He laughed, a harsh barking sound that carried across the corral. "Well, look at this circus," he jeered, voice loud enough for the ranch hands to hear. "$1 million challenge turned into a damn petting zoo." "What's next, Hayes? You gonna teach him to dance? Maybe play him a lullaby?" The men flanking him chuckled, egged on by his performance. Jake cupped his hands around his mouth and called again louder, "Play another tune, soldier boy." Maybe the devil horse will sing along, or do you charge admission for the world's saddest concert? Laughter erupted from his companions. A couple of ranch hands snickered too, though uneasily, while others frowned. One younger hand pulled out his phone filming. Within minutes, the clip would be on TikTok. Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't stop playing. The notes continued steady as before, weaving through the dust. Midnight flicked an ear at the noise, but did not spook his attention, still drawn to the man on the fence. Jake scowled at the lack of reaction. He wanted fire. He wanted anger. Instead, he got silence. It was Victoria who answered. She had stepped out from the veranda, her eyes sharp as cut glass. "At least he hasn't left anyone in the hospital," she said, her voice slicing through the laughter. She let the words hang before adding, cool as steel, "How many ribs are still intact these days, Jake?" The bar blanded. The crowd tittered. Jake's face flushed crimson. He glared at her, then at Daniel, and for a moment, the air seemed ready to explode. But he only spat in the dirt, muttered a curse, and swung himself back into the saddle. "This isn't over," he hissed, though not loud enough for all to hear. His eyes lingered on Daniel, a promise of trouble. Then he rode off his friends, following laughter covering the sting of humiliation. But Jake was not finished. That night, from the haze of whiskey and spite, he posted a video to Facebook. His face filled the frame jaw, set voice dripping with mockery. Mallory Ranch, he said, used to mean something. Used to stand for real cowboys, real grit. Now it's a circus, a washed-up vet playing harmonica to a horse. And folks are buying it. $1 million handed over to a con man with a sad story and a cheap trick. He leaned closer, eyes burning. "Don't let them fool you. This isn't horsemanship, it's fraud. And if you've got any respect for the tradition of the West, you won't call it anything else." He uploaded it across platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Within hours, the video spread. Comments poured in a torrent of division. Finally, someone said it. Real men ride. They don't sing lullabies. But others disagreed. Then explain why midnight hasn't killed him yet. Say what you want, at least the horse looks calmer. Better oats and music than spurs and whips. The debate raged, hashtags colliding, devil horse, fake cowboy, trust, not force. By the end of the week, the video had tens of thousands of views. Bloggers dissected it. Local news anchors played clips side by side, Jake's ridicule versus footage of Daniel brushing Midnight's mane. The question filled headlines: is patience the new horsemanship, or just a con? In Esperanza, the split was everywhere. At Dusty's bar, men slammed beers on tables, arguing both sides. Some scoffed, claiming Daniel was an insult to rodeo tradition. "If you can't ride, you ain't a cowboy," one drawled, earning nods from others. But across town, at the feed store and diner, the talk was different. Ordinary townsfolk, those who had seen too many horses broken bloody, found hope in the stranger's quiet methods. "He's the first to make that beast calm," they said. "Maybe there's more to it than brute force." The town hummed with arguments, speculation, gossip. The Mallory Ranch became a pilgrimage site. More visitors came not to try Midnight themselves, but to watch Daniel. They filmed, they whispered, they waited. Victoria felt the pressure building. The ranch was no longer just her home. It was a battleground of ideas, a stage for a fight larger than she'd intended. This wasn't simply about one horse or one man. It was about the meaning of strength itself. Was it domination, or was it patience? And whichever answer won here would echo far beyond Esperanza. When Daniel finally heard about Jake's video, He was sitting on the porch steps, harmonica in his hands. A ranch hand, nervous, had shown him on a phone. Daniel watched silently, expression unmoved. The mocking words played, the insults repeated. When the clip ended, he handed the phone back and chuckled softly, shaking his head. War taught me something, he said at last. Words don't kill. Bullets do. This, he gestured vaguely toward the phone, this is just noise. Then he rose, dusted off his jeans, and headed back toward the corral where midnight waited. From the shadows of the veranda, Victoria watched him go, a strange warmth settling in her chest. She had seen arrogance, cruelty, cowardice, bravado, but rarely this. A man who could meet ridicule, not with fury, not with denial, but with calm certainty. For the first time in years, she felt her respect deepen into something else, something she was not yet ready to name. The afternoon sun slid low over Mallory Ranch, painting the land in rust and gold. The air carried the dry tang of dust and the faint scent of hay. Work was winding down hands, leading horses back to stalls, the distant clank of buckets echoing from the barn. From the veranda of the ranch house, Victoria Mallory tried to savor the fragile calm. But there was tension in the air, a weight she couldn't name. It arrived in the form of Dr. Leonard Bishop. The old veterinarian moved with the stiffness of age, his shoulders stooped, his hair thin and white. He had been part of the ranch for longer than Victoria had been alive, tending horses through drought and storm births and deaths. He had taught her to ride when she was a girl, had patched her knees after falls, had stood beside her father during auctions. To Victoria, Leonard Bishop was more family than colleague. So when he climbed the veranda steps that evening, a manila envelope clutched tight in his hands, she knew something was wrong. His face was grave, his eyes shadowed. "Evening, Victoria," he said quietly. She frowned, setting aside the glass of iced tea she'd been holding. "Leonard, you look like you've seen a ghost." "Not a ghost," he replied, his voice heavy. "But maybe the truth. And I'm not sure it's any kinder." He held out the envelope. Its edges were crumpled, the paper stained as though it had been shoved into pockets and spilled on bar counters. "What's this?" she asked, suspicion flickering in her chest. "Something Jake Turner gave me. He was drunk, said he couldn't carry it anymore. Called it the truth nobody dares to say." Victoria's heart thumped. She took the envelope slowly, her fingers brushing the brittle paper. "If it's from Jake, it's probably another one of his lies." Bishop shook his head. "I don't think so. I've known Jake since he was a boy. He's reckless, he's angry, but he's not creative enough to make this up. You need to see it, even if it hurts." The solemn weight in his voice stilled her protest. She opened the flap and pulled out the folded sheets inside. The writing scrawled across them was jagged, slanted ink, blotched by spills. She smelled whiskey on the paper itself. Her hands trembled as she began to read. The letter rambled uneven, as though written through the fog of alcohol. But the meaning was clear enough. It spoke of a night, 2 years past, the night her husband Richard Mallory had died. Everyone had said it was an accident, that Richard, drunk and reckless, had wandered too close to the wrong stallion and been kicked. The whispers had spread, the story accepted. A cruel irony, some called it, the powerful rancher undone by his own horse. But the letter told a different story. Richard hadn't died in a barn. He had died in a smoky card room behind a roadside bar. He had been caught cheating marked cards slipping from his sleeve. The game turned ugly, voices raised, fists thrown, and then a gun. A shot in the chest. The letter claimed Jake had been there, along with 2 others. They had panicked, No one wanted the scandal, the shame that would ruin the Mallory name and taint the town's pride. So they had lied. They had dragged Richard's body back to the ranch, staged the scene, bribed a couple of drifters to remember seeing him stumble toward the stalls. The last line stopped her breath cold. He was a cruel man. Everyone knew it. Everyone knew what he did to you. But no one spoke. Better a lie than the truth. Better to let you bear it alone. Victoria's vision blurred. The paper slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the porch floor. The world tilted. She staggered back, clutching the veranda rail, as though the wood itself was the only thing holding her upright. 2 years she had carried that story, the image of her husband felled by a horse's kick. She had hated him, yes, but she had believed the lie. Now the truth unfurled with vicious cruelty. He had not just been cruel in life, he had been dishonorable in death. A cheat, a liar, a man who had dragged her name down, even in his final breath. And worse than anything was the knowledge that the community had known. They had known what he was. They had known what he did to her behind closed doors. The bruises she had hidden beneath silk, the silences at church, the way she never laughed. They had known, and they had chosen to remain silent. The betrayal scalded her. Images crowded her mind. Richard's fists slamming against the table, his voice rising like a storm. The fear that lived in her chest every night. The mornings she painted over bruises with powder and smiled for the cameras. And now to know that everyone had seen and looked away, neighbors, friends, allies, was unbearable. Her knees gave out. She sank onto the veranda steps, her breath ragged. And for the first time in years, the Ice Queen of Texas broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks, unchecked, raw sobs ripping from her throat. Daniel found her there. He didn't ask questions at first. He saw the crumpled papers on the floor, the tears streaking her face, and he simply sat beside her, silent. The evening breeze stirred, carrying the faint smell of sage, the distant whinny of horses. At last, between gasps, Victoria managed, it was all a lie. He didn't die the way they said. He was worse. And they knew. They all knew what he did to me. And they stayed quiet. Her voice broke. Daniel's gaze softened. He didn't reach for platitudes, didn't offer the empty comfort others might. He simply placed his hands on his knees, leaned forward, and spoke quietly. My mother, he said, was beaten by my father. Drunk most nights, angry the rest. I grew up listening to the sound of his fists on her skin. I hated myself for being too small to stop him. Victoria turned her tear-streaked face toward him. His voice was low, steady, but heavy with memory. When I was 15, I fought back. Broke his nose, got my mother out. But the shame stayed, for years. Because when you live in that house, when you live with that silence, you believe it's your fault. You believe the world sees you as weak. His hand, calloused and scarred, reached out and covered hers. You survived, he said, his voice firm. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you stronger than anyone who ever stayed silent. Her breath hitched, a sob catching in her chest. She closed her fingers around his clinging. Daniel looked out across the ranch to where midnight grazed in the fading light. That horse he lashes out because he doesn't trust, because he remembers every hand that ever hurt him. But he's still here, still breathing, still willing if someone's patient enough to believe again. You and me were not so different. The words sank into her, breaking something open that she had thought long sealed. She bowed her head, tears falling freely now, not of shame, but of release. For the first time in years, she let herself be seen raw and unguarded, And Daniel was there, not as rescuer, not as judge, but as witness. Night settled cool air flowing in from the desert. The two of them sat side by side on the veranda steps, the papers forgotten at their feet. They didn't speak much after that. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer a wall, but a bridge. Victoria leaned her head against his shoulder, the weight of years slipping from her bones. Her tears dampened his shirt, but he didn't move, didn't pull away. He only let her rest. After a long time, Daniel's voice came again, low, steady. "We don't have to forget," he said. "We don't have to forgive. We just have to make sure the past doesn't chain us down." She lifted her head, her eyes swollen, her voice a whisper. "I don't know if I can." "You can," he said simply, "because you already are." They fell silent again, watching the horizon fade into night. Crickets began to sing. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Victoria closed her eyes, leaning into the warmth of him, the weight of his hand still resting over hers. And in that fragile stillness, something shifted. What had begun as mutual understanding, as shared scars, grew into something more. A connection forged not in victory or pride, but in the raw truth of survival. For the first time, the Ice Queen allowed herself to be vulnerable. And for the first time, Daniel allowed himself to hope. The 21st morning dawned crisp, the kind of desert morning where the cool air still clung stubbornly to the earth before the sun rose high enough to scorch it away. At Mallory Ranch, the usual rhythm had already begun, hands carrying feed, the clang of buckets, the low calls of cattle in the distance. Yet today, there was an undercurrent of tension humming through the place, an unspoken awareness that something was different. Daniel Hayes walked toward the corral with his usual steady gait. Coffee in one hand, harmonica in the other. He looked no different from the man who had sat there for 3 weeks running. But today, he did not stop at the fence. Today, he intended to step inside. The stallion waited in the open space, massive and imposing even in stillness. Midnight pawed at the ground, once a reminder of the danger coiled inside his frame. But he no longer charged the fence, no longer reared with the fury that had once defined him. Daniel had become a fixture in his world, as familiar as the dawn. Word had spread among the ranch hands. A few gathered by the fence line, whispering nervously. One held up a phone, recording, convinced they were about to capture the inevitable disaster, another man flattened by the devil horse. Victoria Mallory stood on the veranda, her arms folded tightly, jaw set. Her heart hammered harder than she wanted to admit. She had told herself she would stop him if he tried this too soon. But when she saw him open the gate and step inside with nothing but his harmonica, no rope, no whip, no bridle, something kept her silent. The air seemed to thicken as Daniel crossed the corral, each footstep slow, deliberate. Midnight's ears pinned back for a heartbeat, then flicked forward again, uncertain. The stallion snorted, circling warily. No one breathed. Daniel stopped near the center of the arena. He lowered himself to the dirt, crossing his legs, placing the coffee mug beside him. Slowly, he lifted the harmonica. The first notes floated out low and haunting the same melody he had played every morning. A song stitched from sorrow and longing, yet carrying within it a fragile thread of hope. The sound filled the wide space, curling into the rafters of the silent stands, drifting out into the desert air. Midnight paced along the edge, circling, his muscles taut with the memory of every cruel hand that had ever tried to dominate him. But the music held him. His steps slowed, his head lowered slightly. The minutes stretched. Daniel never moved toward him, never broke the rhythm. He only played, eyes half-lidded, his body still as stone. And then, almost imperceptibly, Midnight's circle tightened. from 20 yards to 15, from 15 to 10. His breathing grew audible, deep and steady, each exhale stirring dust from the ground. Victoria gripped the railing, her knuckles white. Closer. The stallion came within 5 yards. His ears flicked back, then forward, his tail swishing nervously. He hesitated, pawed the dirt, once, then stepped again. Daniel let the last note fade. He lowered the harmonica to his lap, his hand moving instead to the earth beside him. Palm open, fingers spread. The world seemed to stop. Midnight stretched his neck forward, eyes rolling white for a moment. He snorted, stamping once, as though daring himself. Then slowly, he closed the distance. The great black head dipped, muzzle brushing the offered hand. Daniel did not flinch. He lifted his other hand so slowly it was nearly imperceptible, and touched the place just behind the stallion's ear. Midnight froze. Every muscle in his body tensed. Then, with a shuddering breath, he allowed it. His eyes half closed, his head sinking lower, and a deep sigh escaped him, a sound of release, of surrender, of trust. The ranch erupted in gasps. Holy hell. One hand whispered, phone shaking in his grip. Another muttered, "That's not possible." Victoria felt her chest tighten, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes despite herself. She had not cried when her husband died, had not cried when men mocked her challenge. But now, watching the devil horse lean into Daniel's hand like a child seeking comfort, her vision blurred. Her hands trembled where they gripped the railing. For the first time in years, her composure cracked. By the next day, the video had spread like wildfire. The clip of Midnight lowering his head into Daniel's touch flooded social media feeds. TikTok loops, YouTube uploads, Facebook shares. It trended under hashtags Devil Horse Tamed, Trust, Not Force, Miracle at Mallory. Comment sections exploded. Never thought I'd see the day. It's gotta be drugs, no horse changes like that. Say what you want, but that stallion looks calm. That's new. Within 48 hours, the clip had hundreds of thousands of views. Local news stations sent reporters back to the ranch. ESPN ran a highlight reel. For the first time, the conversation shifted from ridicule to awe. Even the ranch hands who had doubted, who had mocked the harmonica routine, now watched Daniel with something like reverence. They gave him nods, offered him quiet words of respect. The mood of the ranch itself had changed. Where there had been tension, there was now hope. The stranger had done what no champion had achieved. He had not broken the horse. He had earned him. That evening, Victoria did something she had never done for any rider before. She invited Daniel to dinner in the main house. The long oak table, usually polished for investors or dignitaries, was set simply 2 places, a bottle of wine between them. Candlelight flickered against the tall windows, softening the steel edges of the room. For the first time, they sat not as employer and hired hand, but as 2 people sharing a meal. Conversation came easier than either expected. They spoke of her father, a hard man who had demanded perfection in all things, who had taught her to mask every weakness. They spoke of her husband, the weight of his shadow, and the bitter relief of his absence. Victoria's voice wavered, but she did not falter. Daniel spoke of war. He did not linger on battles or medals, but on the men he had lost, the voices he still heard in dreams. He spoke, too, of the fire that had taken his wife and daughter while he was half a world away. His tone was quiet, stripped of drama, but the pain lingered in every syllable. The candles burned low. The wine loosened the iron grip of silence. And in the soft light, Victoria looked at him differently. He was not merely the stranger who had tamed her horse. He was a man who understood the language of scars. She felt something shift inside her. A door long rusted shut creaked open. The days that followed carried a new rhythm. Victoria found reasons to linger at the corral. Daniel brushed Midnight's mane, and she would lean on the fence, asking questions that had nothing to do with horses. He answered with the same quiet honesty that had become his hallmark. Sometimes he played the harmonica not for the stallion, but for her. She would stand close, the notes weaving around them, filling spaces neither dared to speak into. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, she reached for his hand. Her fingers brushed against the long scar that ran across his knuckles, a remnant of battles fought. He did not pull away. He only looked at her, his dark eyes steady, searching. In the silence that followed, something passed between them, an unspoken permission, a surrender of walls. Her hand lingered. His breath caught. And then, without ceremony, without preamble, their lips met. It was not the desperate kiss of strangers, nor the polished kiss of practiced lovers. It was tentative, tender, laced with years of restraint finally broken. A meeting of grief and hope, of wounds and healing. When they parted, both knew there was no turning back. What had begun as patience with a horse had become something far greater. And for the first time in too long, both Daniel Hayes and Victoria Mallory believed they could love again. The afternoon at Mallory Ranch should have been quiet. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long, amber shadows across the corrals. A dry breeze stirred the dust, carrying the familiar smells of hay and horse sweat. Most of the hands had finished for the day, moving at an easy pace, checking stalls or leaning against fences. In the main corral, Daniel Hayes stood beside Midnight, running a brush in long, steady strokes along the stallion's gleaming flank. The horse had come to accept the ritual, his dark body relaxed beneath the rhythm of the man's hand. Each drag of the brush brought a soft sigh from Midnight, each pause answered by a flick of his ear toward Daniel. It was a picture of peace until the crunch of hooves shattered it. 3 riders appeared at the far end of the drive, their silhouettes outlined against the fiery sky. At the center rode Jake Turner, his posture, cocky hat tipped back, a smirk twisting his face. On either side were 2 men Victoria recognized by reputation, if not by name, rodeo drifters, with fists quicker than their buckles, men who had started more bar fights than competitions. Their swagger carried an edge that set the ranch hands muttering uneasily. Jake dismounted with a deliberate slam of boots against gravel. His companions followed, eyes, hard steps, heavy. They moved toward the corral, as though it belonged to them, as though the entire ranch were theirs to trespass. The workers fell silent, their tools forgotten. Conversations died mid-sentence. A few moved discreetly closer, not to interfere, but to be near if fists flew. From the veranda of the main house, Victoria Mallory stepped out. Her figure was as composed as ever, shoulders back, chin lifted, but a flicker of unease betrayed her. She scanned the scene, Daniel at the center of the corral, Jake swaggering forward with his shadows in tow, the hands watching with bated breath. The air tightened like a drawn bowstring. Jake was the first to speak. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice carrying across the yard. "If it isn't our local war hero turning Mallory Ranch into a daycare for horses. I had to see this circus for myself." His companions chuckled. One added with mockery, "Heard the devil horses tame now." "What's the trick? Hayes' sweet lullabies, maybe a bedtime story." Laughter followed, sharp and ugly. Daniel didn't look up. He continued brushing Midnight with the same steady strokes, the stallion unmoved by the noise. Jake smirked wider, enjoying the audience. Imagine that. $1 million challenge turned into a cheap parlor trick. Folks used to respect this ranch. Now it's just a stage for a washed-up vet who can't even ride. He raised his voice so the hands the men with phones already recording would hear, "This is a scam. He's conning you, conning her, and dragging every real cowboy's name through the mud." Victoria's voice cut through before Daniel could answer. From the veranda, sharp as glass, "Funny Jake. I don't remember you lasting more than 4 seconds on midnight. How many ribs did he break? 3, 4. The ranch hands chuckled nervously. Jake's jaw tightened. He spat in the dirt. "I see what's happening here. You're blinded, Mallory. This guy, he's using you. He'll take the money and vanish, and all you'll have left is a circus act." The words hung heavy. Even midnight stilled, sensing the shift in air. At last, Daniel set the brush down. He slid the gate open and stepped out of the corral, closing it behind him. His movements were calm, measured. He peeled off his work gloves, tucking them into his belt, and walked toward Jake. The noise of boots, scuffing of horses shifting in stalls seemed to fade. The yard went silent, the weight of expectation pressing down on every man and woman present. Daniel stopped a few paces away, his eyes steady on Jake. When he spoke, his voice was low, even, but laced with steel. "I don't want trouble," he said. "But hear me clear, Turner. If you reach for that gun on your hip, you'd better use it, because I won't give you a second chance." The words were not shouted, not theatrical. They were flat factual, and in them was something that froze the blood and the unmistakable cadence of a soldier, a man who had lived and commanded in places where hesitation meant death. Jake's smirk faltered. The ranch yard seemed to hold its breath. Every hand stilled. Every eye watched. For the first time, Jake's bravado wavered. He shifted, trying to hold his ground, but the weight of Daniel's gaze pressed into him like a physical force. His companions glanced at each other, their swagger draining. One muttered under his breath, "He ain't bluffing." The silence stretched heavy as storm clouds. Jake's hand twitched near his holster, but then he thought better of it. He snarled instead, stepping back with a growl. "This isn't over." He spat, his voice low-edged with humiliation. He jerked his chin at his men. They turned, boots striking sharp against gravel, the 3 of them retreating toward their horses. Before mounting, Jake cast one last glance over his shoulder, hatred burning in his eyes, directed at both Daniel and Victoria. A promise. The 3 riders galloped off, the echo of hooves fading into the distance, leaving only dust and unease behind. The ranch yard exhaled in unison. Conversations resumed in murmurs, workers shaking their heads, whispering about what had just unfolded. The tension didn't vanish, it hung there still. But for the moment the storm had passed. Victoria descended the steps, her composure cracked by the adrenaline still coursing through her. She approached Daniel, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. "You just froze the entire ranch," she whispered. They all stopped breathing. You've commanded men before, haven't you?" Daniel's expression remained calm. He gave a single nod. "I've learned something," he said. "Some men only understand strength, but real strength doesn't always need bullets." His tone was simple, but the words carried weight. Victoria looked at him, her chest tight with a mix of fear and admiration. She knew then that Jake Turner would not walk away quietly. Trouble was coming. But standing there watching the man beside her, she also knew something else. Whatever storm Jake carried back with him, Daniel Hayes would not bend, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid of facing it. By sunrise on the 30th day, Mallory Ranch had become a modern rodeo cathedral. Pickup trucks lined the dirt road like prayer beads trailers stacked 2 deep in the overflow lot. A temporary grandstand rose along the main corral, aluminum bleachers glinting beneath a sky the color of a new dime. Two production box trucks idled near the arena gate, their roofs bristling with antennas. Cables crawled across the ground like vines. Drones hovered and drifted their propellers, whispering as they orbited the ranch house, the barns, the crowd. Vendors hawked brisket tacos and sweet tea from pop-up tents. A pair of local boys worked a folding table outside the entrance, with a laptop and a chalkboard taking bets 10-to-1 odds that nobody lasted a lap. A woman in a fringe jacket sold t-shirts emblazoned with a snorting black stallion and the slogan, "I saw the devil horse." On the grandstand, a cluster of influencers practiced their smiles into phone cameras. A regional sports network set up a sideline desk with two anchors in crisp Western shirts and immaculate hair. The murmurs rolled like a tide. "It's a stunt." Has to be. Not what I heard. That vet's got the horse eating out of his hand. Eating's one thing. Riding's another. Hell, I saw the video, he touched it. With his hand. No rope. Edited. Maybe. Maybe not. Beyond the fence, the town of Esperanza seemed to have emptied into the bleachers. Ranch hands sat shoulder to shoulder with teachers, mechanics, bartenders. Old men in pressed hats, little kids with foam fingers shaped like horseshoes. Every face pointed toward the corral. Every conversation bent around a single name: Midnight. Up on the central platform, Victoria Mallory stood in a tailored jacket the color of the evening sky. From a distance, she looked composed, but her hands tightened and loosened on the rail in a rhythm only she could feel. She had signed releases, posted disclaimers, hired extra medics, even though the county EMTs were already stationed behind the chutes. She had built an event from a dare. Now it felt like a verdict. The PA crackled. A producer counted down into a broadcaster's ear. "We are live across Texas," the anchor announced, voice resonant. "This is the $1 Million Devil Horse Challenge. Can a quiet cowboy without sponsors or swagger do what 29 professionals could not? You're about to find out." Inside the prep barn, the noise fell away. Dust motes floated in shafts of light like slow snow. Daniel Hayes stood beside Midnight's stall in a plain denim shirt, faded jeans, and scuffed boots. There was no logo on his hat, no patch on his sleeve. He glanced once at the battered saddle perched on a rail leather, burnished by years of use stirrups, tuned to his measure, and then set it back down. In his breast pocket, the shape of a harmonica pressed against the cloth. He laid a hand on Midnight's shoulder. The stallion's flesh was warm beneath his palm. The muscle twitched, then settled. Daniel leaned close, his voice a low thread in the hush. "Today isn't about proving I'm strong," he murmured. "It's to show them you're still free even with me on your back." Midnight drew in a long breath and let it out a soft rumble like distant thunder. His ears flicked toward Daniel's voice. His dark eye was steady. A volunteer poked his head around the door. 2 minutes. Daniel nodded. He took the harmonica from his pocket, weighed it in his hand, then slipped it back. "You ready, friend?" he asked softly. Midnight shifted closer until their shoulders touched the bars. They stepped out together. A hush fell over the grandstand as the pair emerged into the sun. For a heartbeat, the drones seemed to freeze. Camera lenses found the stallion, the enormous black body, the thick arch of neck, the mane like storm surf, and then drifted to the man at his side. The contrast sharpened on a dozen screens, the plainness, the calm. "Unbelievable," a commentator breathed. "Look at that horse's eye. That's not rage. That's attention." Midnight's hooves sank into the tan sand as Daniel led him toward the gate. There was no rope on the stallion's head, only a simple halter and a loose lead, as if Daniel had brought him on a walk rather than into a storm. The murmurs nodded again. That can't be the same animal. They switched horses. It's him. Look at the star on the forehead. Same shape. On the platform, Victoria's knuckles went white. She couldn't feel the breeze anymore. She only felt the vibrating wire of her breath. Daniel paused at the corral gate, looked out across the bleachers, then down at Midnight. He lifted the lead off the halter and coiled it over his arm. The gate swung open. He walked in first. Midnight followed. The crowd's noise swelled, then fractured into pockets of disbelieving sound. Daniel crossed the corral to the saddle resting on a rail and set it gently in the sand. He palmed the harmonica, raised it just long enough to lay a few bars into the heat, an invocation more than a song. Midnight's ears pivoted and settled. His head lowered a fraction. Daniel tucked the harmonica away. He lifted the saddle. He did not hide his movements, did not rush or sneak. He presented the weight to Midnight's eye, let the stallion smell the leather, then laid it across the horse's back. And Midnight did not explode. He stood ribs, swelling, the great lungs filling. Then he eased his neck down, a gesture so small and shocking that 100 people gasped at once and allowed the cinch to come under his belly. Daniel's hands moved with practiced economy latigo through the ring, pulled snug a pause another hole. The arena changed pitch. It wasn't disbelief anymore. It was the scrape of belief breaking loose. Daniel slid a boot in the stirrup and waited. His body went very still. He glanced once at the platform where Victoria stood, only a glance, but long enough for her to see it, and then he swung up. Not a leap, not a dare. A clean, unhurried motion of trust. For one long second, nothing happened. For another, Midnight let the weight settle across his spine, his ears flicking back and forward. On the third, he took a step. A woman near the rail started to cry. The anchors stopped speaking mid-sentence. Their mouths hung half open in a silent cheer. The stallion walked a quarter of the corral, then lifted into a jog, then at the lightest press of Daniel's leg, stretched into a canter as fluid as water. One lap. People rose to their feet. Hats shot into the air. On a dozen phones, the live stream comment counter spun like a slot machine. 2 laps. The noise turned physical, a pressure pressing inward from every seat and rail. Children screamed with joy. Old men shouted themselves hoarse. The drones dipped low and swept upward again in looping arcs, like they could not restrain their own excitement. 3 laps. The corral detonated into applause, into tears, into the animal sound of release. Daniel brought Midnight to the center and let him stand, breathing deep foam, faint at the corners of his mouth, but his eye still soft, still aware. Daniel peeled his hat off and rested it against his thigh. A ranch hand sprinted a wireless mic to the rail, thrust it up with shaking hands. Daniel took it, thumbed it on, and looked out at the crowd that had wanted blood and was now begging for grace. "I didn't break him," he said, his voice carrying clean as a bell. "He chose to trust me." Silence rolled across the arena as if every throat closed at once. Then the sound returned, bigger than before. Bigger than any rodeo Victoria had ever hosted, louder than the wind that ripped across the plains in spring. The applause became a wave, washing over the fence, the rails, the platforms. On the grandstand, Victoria's hand flew to her mouth. The world doubled. She saw the animal standing at peace, the man sitting easy, and she saw a door swing wide in her chest. "He did it," she whispered to no one and everyone. "My God, he did it." Chapter 10, The Shot. The applause was still cresting when the rifle report tore the sky. It cracked the air without warning, one dry, vicious snap that seemed to pop reality like a balloon. Drones lurched. Birds burst from the windbreak leaves, flared and settled. People screamed. Daniel's body jerked, a red flower blooming high on his left shoulder. The mic dropped from his hand and crackled against the sand. He slid to one knee, his boot skidding a pale furrow across the arena, then toppled sideways. Midnight reared a roar, ripping out of him. There wasn't a sound so much as a storm. Every instinct in a prey animal's bones screamed to run. But he didn't. He came down and surged toward the fallen man, swinging his body between Daniel and the ridgeline beyond the parking lot. He planted his hooves 1-2, spreading his massive chest toward the source of the shot, his ears pinned flat, his eyes black with fury. "Oh my God," someone shouted. "He's protecting him." The live stream kept rolling. Cameras found the pool of red spreading across denim, the white of Daniel's clenched jaw. The crowd compressed and then flung itself outward, people diving behind the rails and beneath the bleachers. Someone shouted for medics. Someone else sobbed into a phone. A child cried high and frantic and was swept up into a stranger's arms. On the front row, Sheriff Emilio Ramirez was already moving. He had come in uniform at Victoria's request, not to be seen, but to be present. Now his hand cleared leather before most people understood the sound they'd heard. "Down," he bellowed, voice made for command. "Everybody down, stay low." He wheeled toward the ridge eyes, raking the scrub. For a breath, he saw nothing. Only sunlight on rocks and the shimmer of heat. But then he caught the glint, a rifle barrel above a juniper. A hat jerked low. The shooter swung a leg over a horse hidden just below the crest and kicked hard. Ramirez was in the saddle before the second beat, heels and body flat to his mare's neck. He took the fence on an angle that would have gotten any other man fired and cleared it with a rattle of boards and a flash of iron shoes. In the parking lot, a deputy hit a siren that howled like a wounded thing. 2 patrol cars shot dust fountains skyward and tore for the county road lights, strobing. On the hill, the shooter's horse lunged through chaparral, the rider swaying, too eager, too sloppy. Jake Ramirez roared as he climbed the slope. Drop the rifle. Jake Turner didn't drop the rifle. He threw a look over his shoulder, wild-eyed, and fired once the shot sailing high and left shattering a rock. He misjudged the next turn, his stirrup clipped a stump, and he lurched nearly out of the saddle. The rifle slid, clattered, and tumbled down the slope. Ramirez was on him in 3 strides. He cut Jake off at a narrow wash and pushed him into a chute between boulders. A second unit crested the rise on the far side, dust spraying as the cruiser skidded to a stop. 2 deputies scrambled out, weapons trained. "Hands where I can see them," Ramirez commanded his mare, blowing hard beneath him. Jake's chest heaved. The rage in his face curdled into something different, fear, almost disbelief, that the world had failed to bend to him again. He opened his fingers. His empty hands lifted. A deputy moved in fast. The cuffs clicked, harsh and final. Someone kicked the rifle farther downhill with the toe of a boot. The camera on the drone that had followed the chase like a hawk caught the whole thing, the grapple, the disarm, the final bowing of the man who had once lived on other people's applause. Feeds across the state lit up in real time. Shooter apprehended. Suspect identified as local rodeo cowboy Jake Turner. Down in the corral, chaos had shape. Victoria slid under the rail and ran the hem of her jacket snapping at her calves. A medic converged from the gate with a trauma bag. A second climbed the rail from the grandstand with gauze trailing. 2 ranch hands tried to keep people back, arms out, faces pale. Daniel lay on his right side, left shoulder a mess of blood and torn cloth. His eyes were open, shock white around the irises, but focused. Midnight loomed over him like a wall neck, arched chest heaving. When strangers pressed in too close, he lowered his head, ears flat, big teeth, bared, not attacking, but a warning as clear as a posted sign. It took Daniel's palm on the stallion's shoulder to hold him. "Easy, Daniel," whispered voice, ragged but steady. "Hey, easy, brother. I'm here." Midnight's breath washed hot over him. The giant head lowered until forelock and hat brim touched. He stood like a statue, muscles quivering, as Daniel turned his face into the shadow under the horse's jaw. Victoria dropped to her knees so fast she felt something in her ankle tear. "Daniel," she said. And then she couldn't say anything else because her throat closed. She touched his cheek with fingers that would not stop shaking. "Daniel." He found her eyes and somehow impossibly smiled a fraction. "It's the shoulder," he said, the words dry as dust. "Had worse? Don't talk?" the medic said gently. He sliced Daniel's sleeve away, revealed the wound, a deep gutter across the deltoid muscle, scored, bleeding hard, but clean of shrapnel. Through and through, graze high. "Lucky." He pressed gauze pack, pressed again. "Hold that," he told Victoria, and when she nodded, he laid her hand on the dressing. Blood warmed her palm. She didn't flinch. Another medic knelt at Daniel's hip, checking pupil's pulse. "You with me?" "Yeah." Daniel blinked. "Yeah. On 3 we roll him for exit wounds," the first medic said, and counted them through it. Midnight snorted, feet stamping. Daniel's hand lifted palm out, and the horse froze again. The crowd pressed in and then receded like a tide. Somewhere in the stands, a woman still sobbed. Somewhere else, a child asked, "Is the horse okay?" A voice answered, "He's fine. He's brave." Sheriff Ramirez rode back through the gate at a canter with dust in his teeth and victory in his eyes. He swung down before the mare had fully stopped and strode to the rail. "We've got him." He called to the bleachers, to the cameras, to the mass of fear and fury hunched along the fence line. "Suspect is in custody and disarmed. Stay calm, folks. We're secure." A wave of sound rose and fell, relief, then anger, then a low, stunned murmur. Phones lifted again. Reporters reassembled their composure and their hair. The anchors' voices shook as they filled airtime with words like "tragedy averted" and "heroic stallion" and "law enforcement response." Victoria barely heard any of it. Her world had narrowed to the heat of Daniel's skin under her palm, the iron smell of blood, the soft clack of Midnight's teeth as he chattered in agitation. She bent close until he could feel her breath. "I'm right here," she said. "You don't get to leave. You hear me?" "Not planning on it," Daniel whispered. A flash of humor cut through the pain. "We still have dinner plans?" "Idiot," she said, and a broken laugh jumped out of her because the alternative was a sob. The medic slid a board under him with practiced efficiency. Midnight hated that the stranger's lifting his person, the straps, the strange smells. He rocked, nostrils flared. "Okay," Daniel breathed, turning his head so the words poured into the hollow below the stallion's eye. "Listen to me. Stay. With her. Stay." Midnight trembled and then planted his hooves. One of the medics stared openly. "I've never seen ya," the other said softly. "Me neither." They lifted. Daniel hissed air through his teeth, but didn't cry out. Victoria walked alongside, hand on the dressing, the other on the edge of the backboard. Midnight tracked their movement like a shadow, every step measured to theirs. At the gate, the stallion balked, and for a second, everything threatened to break the rope. The control, the fragile spell. "Hey," Daniel said sharply, a commander's note slipping into the single syllable. Midnight's head snapped toward him. "Stay with her." The big horse blew hard, then impossible and perfect fell in beside Victoria, shoulder brushing her hip, as if he understood chain of command. In the alley beyond the gate, the EMT crew took over, with a waiting gurney. The ranch hands cleared a corridor through the milling crowd. People leaned back, pressed flat to give room. Some reached toward Daniel with grateful fingers and then thought better of touching him. Others reached toward Midnight and glanced off his warning eye. At the ambulance doors, the medics started to load. Midnight thrust forward, panic clawing at the edges again, and it took both Victoria's palm on his cheek and Daniel's voice, thin, almost gone, to keep him from forcing his way inside. "I'll be right behind you," Victoria promised, laying her forehead briefly to the horses. "I swear." Midnight let out a rumbling sound that made a cameraman lower his lens without quite knowing why. The stallion backed a step. The doors swung. The siren wound up into a steady wail that peeled out over the grandstand and down the road toward Esperanza General. Sheriff Ramirez fell in beside the ambulance in his cruiser. Deputies loaded Jake Turner into the back of another car, his hands cuffed, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. He stared at the ambulance tail lights shrinking on the highway, and something like emptiness gutted his expression. A reporter shouted a question through the rolled-down back window, something about why, about shame, about regret. Jake turned his face to the seat and said nothing. Inside the arena, the sand was scarred with hoof prints and a line of blood the size of a hand. A volunteer with a rake started smoothing the furrows, because work is what a body does when it can't hold still. On the platform, the anchors shifted into solemn cadence. A triumph and a tragedy, one intoned. But tonight, thanks to a swift response and a remarkable horse, what might have been fatal appears survivable. Victoria stood very still in the alley after the ambulance had gone, one hand gripping the gatepost, until the wood engraved itself into her palm. Midnight pressed his shoulder against her, solid and immense, his heat anchoring her to the ground. She exhaled for the first time since the shot. Her voice was a rasp. "Good boy," she whispered to the devil horse who had become a guardian. "Good boy." A soft wind moved across the ranch, lifting dust-drying tears carrying the scent of sage and hot metal. Somewhere behind the barns, a drone landed, its rotors ticking as they wound down. Over the loudspeakers, nothing. Only the hush of a crowd learning how to breathe again. In the sudden quiet, the image that would outlive the day took form and settled like a brand on the county's memory. A bloodied man on a gurney with a crooked smile. A woman in a storm blue jacket with one hand red and steady. And a black stallion standing sentry head, lowered ears forward as if listening for the one voice that had taught him the meaning of trust. Daniel surfaced from darkness to the beeping of machines and the smell of antiseptic. Ceiling tiles swam into focus one by one. His left shoulder burned a deep, pulsing ache, but the pain felt oddly far away, like thunder beyond the hills. A soft voice anchored him. "Hey." Victoria sat beside the hospital bed, her hair pulled back, her blouse wrinkled in a way he had never seen. The usual armor of poise was gone. She looked human and tired and heartbreakingly present. "You're at Esperanza General," she said, reading the question in his eyes. The bullet went through the shoulder, clean pass. They removed it. No major vessels. You scared me. He tried to smile. It came out crooked. "Sorry to be dramatic." The door swung open. Sheriff Ramirez stepped in with the attending physician, a woman in blue scrubs who radiated practical competence. "Captain Hayes," the doctor said, glancing at a chart, "you're a stubborn one. You'll keep the arm, but you'll need weeks, no heroics. Physical therapy, rest, no saddles for a while." Ramirez tipped his hat. "And for the record, we've got the bastard." Turner tried to run. Didn't get far. The live stream caught the whole thing, from the ride to the shot to me tackling him into a prickly pear. State police took custody. He'll face attempted murder and a long list of other sins. Daniel exhaled. "Good." The doctor adjusted his IV and left. Ramirez lingered. His gaze softened when he looked at Victoria, who hadn't moved her hand from Daniel's. "You'll pull through," he said, then added with a lopsided smile. "And if the press asks, tell him the horse is the real hero. That animal wouldn't budge from your side." Biggest deputy I ever saw. After the sheriff left, quiet folded back over the room. Victoria's fingers traced the line of tape along Daniel's shoulder, careful not to touch the wound. Her voice had a tremor he'd never heard. "You smiled when you saw Midnight step in front of you," she whispered. "Why? Because he chose me," Daniel said. "Not because I made him, because he wanted to." The story moved like lightning through the state. Photos of the stallion shielding his fallen riders splashed across screens and broadsheets. The devil horse who guarded a man. Clips replayed the moment Daniel had raised his hat and said, "I didn't break him. He chose to trust me." Now, new commentary followed, and then the horse chose to protect him. Reporters camped in hospital corridors, trading guesses with nurses carrying coffee. The set piece that gripped them most was not the rifle nor the arrest, but the sight caught by a telephoto lens of Victoria Mallory sitting at Daniel's bedside. Her hand cupping his jaw while he drifted in and out of sleep. The caption under one photo said what many were thinking: the woman who dared Texas and the man who changed her mind. Days bled into one another. Dressings changed. Pain ebbed. The constant that didn't waver was Victoria, present at rounds, dozing in an uncomfortable chair, reading contracts on a tablet with one hand while her other held his. Staff learned to bring a second coffee on their checks. No one asked her to leave after visiting hours. One quiet afternoon, a breeze from the desert slipped through the cracked window, carrying the faintest scent of creosote. The machines hummed. The hallway outside was blessedly still. Victoria reached for Daniel's hand and didn't let go. "I have something to say," she murmured, eyes shimmering. "And I can't dress it up." His fingers curled around hers. "Okay. You gave me back my faith," she said. "Not just in horses, in people, in myself." She swallowed, steadying her breath. "I spent years building walls so I wouldn't have to be hurt again by my father's expectations, by Richard's cruelty, by this town's silence. And then you brought music to a fence line and waited. You waited for a creature everyone else called a monster. You waited for me too, even when I didn't know that's what I needed." She blinked, and a tear fell. "I don't want you to go anywhere. I don't want this to be a story that happened to me. I want it to be my life." He took that in the weight and wonder of it, like rain on long-baked ground. He had pictured this moment in broken shards, always in motion, always slipping away. Here it had a body and a name. "I thought I'd used up all my tomorrows," he said, voice rough. "I thought the fire took every good thing that could happen to me." He glanced toward the window, and back at the woman holding his hand, as if it were the lodestar in a dark sky. "Then I met you, and that horse. Midnight taught me that some wounds don't make you wild, they make you careful. He taught me that patience isn't passivity. It's choosing to stay when running would be easier." He smiled, the lines at his eyes deepening. "I'm not asking for the million, I don't want prize money. I want here." He squeezed her hand. "I want you, and work worth doing." She let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob, a fragile, breathless thing. He lifted her knuckles to his lips and kissed them. Later, Sheriff Ramirez eased the door open again, cleared his throat, and took in the tableau, two people who had found each other across a field of dust, fear, and public spectacle. "Well, I'll be," he said, grin tugging. Turns out the hardest ride at Mallory Ranch wasn't 3 laps on a black horse. It was getting the two of you into the same saddle. They laughed, the room brightening with the small, ordinary miracle of shared joy. In that laughter, before 1,000 stories could be written about them, they silently admitted the truth they owed only to themselves. This was real. This was theirs. 6 months later, the sun climbed over Esperanza and lit a news sign at the end of a long white fence, Mallory Hayes Ranch. The metal letters gleamed against oiled cedar, the hyphen a quiet promise rather than a dividing line. The news flew across Texas like a barn swallow on a tailwind. Commentators who had once called the $1 Million Challenge a sham now called the ranch a model. A Spectacle One headline had read. Now it said, a sanctuary. The story had pivoted from ride to legacy, what would come after triumph and blood. The answer unfolded day by day. Victoria and Daniel ran the operation the way they had ridden midnight together. She handled finance contracts, the press calls that never seemed to end. Daniel built a training curriculum for horses, and people hired additional hands and instituted safety protocols that would have impressed any battalion commander. Their days started before dawn and bled past sunset. They bickered about scheduling like old ranchers, laughed like teenagers when a rescued colt discovered the joy of a stock tank, and made difficult decisions as equals, sometimes slowly, sometimes after hours of quiet, deliberate listening. People respected them. Not for the money, though there was plenty of it. Not for the fame, though, that had come whether they wanted it or not. They were respected for the way they looked at what had broken them, and instead of hiding the cracks, used them like seams to bind a new thing together. The $1 million sat like something radioactive for a week, too bright, too heavy. Finally, Daniel said what both of them had been circling. We can't keep this. No, Victoria agreed softly. We can't. She looked out across the pasture where midnight grazed with 2 younger geldings, with the stallion still even now shadowing the path of the man who had taught him to trust. Let's make it do the work. They drafted the papers at the kitchen table with Dr. Bishop and the bank manager with Ramirez, insisting on language that would protect the vulnerable, and with a young attorney from the county, one of the few women of her class, who cried when she saw the mission statement. They called it the Mallory Hayes Trust. Its mandate was simple and audacious: to rescue horses who had been starved, beaten, or abandoned, and to extend the same care to women who had lived through violence. The fund paid for transport, veterinary care, feed, and training for the animals, and for safe housing, counseling, legal aid, and job training for the women. It wasn't charity. It was a hand held out with dignity on both sides of the halter rope. When a reporter asked why they chose those 2 lanes, Victoria answered without flinching. Because we know what it's like to be disbelieved, she said, and because healing is contagious when you let it be. Daniel added, because trust goes where it's fed. The first public information session packed the town hall. Cowboys stood next to school teachers, ranch wives, next to college kids with cameras, all of them listening as Victoria laid out the logistics, like a field general intake process, safety protocols, what the ranch could and could not promise. When the Q&A turned skeptical, what if someone lies? What if a horse is too far gone? Daniel stepped to the mic and said, we'll start with patience. We'll keep our eyes open. And we'll understand that sometimes the bravest thing a living creature can do is try again tomorrow. Applications poured in. The first woman who arrived under the program was Maria Santos. She stood in the ranch office with a split lip and a bruise fading at the corner of her eye, hands clenched so tight around a backpack that her knuckles blanched. She had left Santa Fe in the pre-dawn hours driving until she ran out of road and fear. Victoria met her not as a director, but as a survivor, and said, "You're safe here," in a tone that made the words true. Mariah worked the feed line the next morning, silent and precise. She didn't touch a horse for a week. On the 8th day, Daniel found her watching from the fence line, while one of the new geldings skittered sideways at a blowing feed sack. He offered her a brush. "You don't have to," he said. She took it. She held it like it might explode. Then cautiously she reached up and touched the horse's shoulder. He flinched and then stilled. She breathed once deeply and began to stroke. By the end of the month, she was leading that gelding between cones. By the end of the second, she was trotting him a grin, cracking open her face like sunlight through storm cloud. "You're a natural," Daniel told her. She blushed, then laughed, the sound shocking her like the first time your voice echoes back to you in a canyon, and you realize the world knows you're there. Not every story was so neat. There were setbacks, a mare who kicked at every approach, a teenager who left in the middle of the night, a panic attack that sent 2 people and 1 horse into separate corners of the ring, shaking. But they built the ranch around the idea that progress is counted in breaths, not headlines. A day without a blow-up was cause for celebration. A day with one was not cause for shame. Word spread. Women arrived from Amarillo, El Paso, Abilene, some with kids in tow, some alone, all of them carrying too much for any one person. The bunkhouse got a new wing, the tack room, a lock system, the office, a wall of bulletin boards, filled with work schedules, custody hearing dates, and notes that said things like, "Remember to breathe," "Eat breakfast," "Call mom." A retired teacher came 2 days a week to tutor. A social worker held group sessions in the evenings, while Daniel sat on the porch steps outside and played the harmonica too quietly for anyone to call it a concert, and just right for anyone who needed a reason to sleep. The horses came too. Skinny and sway-backed hooves, overgrown eyes, bright with fear or dull with resignation. They taught patience and absorbed it back. When a skittish Mustang flinched from every hand, Maria stood across the fence and hummed a tune she didn't know she remembered from childhood. "Start there," Daniel told her, and she did. The horse swiveled his ears toward the sound, and something in both of them unclenched. "People think we're saving them," Victoria said one afternoon to a visiting philanthropist as they watched a new arrival lower his head to sniff a child's open palm. "But most days, it feels mutual." The legend of Midnight evolved. He was no longer the devil to be conquered. He was the proof that a violent story could be rewritten without erasing what came before. Tourists asked to see him. Reporters came less often with the question, "How did you do it?" and more often with, "What does it mean?" School buses rolled up in spring. Kids pressed fingers to chain link and fell comma quiet when the big black horse stepped close and breathed on them, fogging the gaps with warm air. The photo that ran alongside every article wasn't the 3 laps. It was Daniel standing beside Midnight, his hand resting lightly on the stallion's neck, the horse's head turned as if he were listening to something only the 2 of them could hear. The caption, more often than not, was a line from that day in the corral, "He chose to trust me." People asked for a motto. Victoria resisted the urge to turn hard-won truths into merch. In the end, she conceded one phrase and put it on the new sign by the office door, "Trust, not force." Practicalities threaded through the poetry. The books had to balance. The feed order had to arrive on time. Payroll had to be met every other Friday. Victoria, who had once kept distance as a shield, found that proximity could be a power. She took calls herself when a prospective donor asked pointed questions. She stood in front of television cameras and said plainly that the ranch would not be everything to everyone, but it would be absolutely something to those it touched. When a local columnist accused the program of glorifying victims, she invited him to volunteer for a week. He mucked stalls, learned to shut up and listen, and wrote a column that began, "I was wrong." There were nights when Victoria woke sweating, heart pounding with old nightmares, and found Daniel's hand on her back, firm and present. There were mornings when Daniel stared at the desert too long, and she brought him coffee and sat silently until his breath matched hers. Their friendship had been forged in the fires of spectacle and danger. Their love was built in the soft labor of ordinary days lists, on the fridge notes and the margins of feed invoices, the way she stole his hat and he let her. They didn't rush a wedding. They didn't need a stage. The hyphen on the sign served as vow enough for now. When people asked, they smiled the same smile and said, "We're building something." On a warm evening in late spring, a small ceremony formed anyway, informal as a campfire. Ramirez grilled meat in the yard. Bishop brought a cake from a bakery that spelled the ranch name wrong, and everyone laughed, and Mariah gathered the women in a circle and told them that this was their place too. Daniel lifted a glass of sweet tea and said, "To tomorrow," which made everyone who knew his past swallow hard and nod. The past didn't stop hunting them. Jake Turner's trial made the news, then the regional news, then faded into the quiet place where sentences are served. He sent no letters. Daniel felt no need to go when the prosecutor asked if he wanted to read a statement in court. He had more important testimonies to deliver, by showing up at dawn, by teaching a terrified colt to yield to a touch, by meeting Maria's eyes after she aced her first ride in the big arena and saying simply, "You did that." One morning, the ranch hosted an open day. Families walked the paddocks, held paper cups of pellets, and learned words like withers and fetlock. In a small demonstration in the main corral, Daniel explained the basics of pressure and release, how bodies talk without sounds. He asked for a volunteer. A boy 8 years old and serious as a judge raised his hand. Daniel gave him a lead rope and showed him how to stand, how to breathe, how to ask, and then wait. The boy asked. The gelding paused. Then he stepped forward one hoof and then the next. The boy looked up astonished. He listened. Daniel smiled. "So did you?" That night, when the ranch had quieted, cicadas stitching the dark with their relentless joy, Daniel and Victoria took their glasses of wine to the porch. The boards had been replaced where the old ones had softened with time and weather. The swing creaked in a way that sounded like home. Across the pasture, midnight grazed a dark silhouette against the last wash of pink. 2 yearlings trotted near him, and he flicked his ears as if amused. A breeze scented with hay rolled over them, lifting a strand of Victoria's hair across her cheek. Daniel reached and tucked it behind her ear without thinking. She caught his hand and held it there a heartbeat longer. They watched the horses. They watched the horizon learn to be night. "Do you regret anything?" she asked quietly. The question had haunted her since the hospital, since the public turned them into a story. It wasn't about PR. It was the question that sits inside every second chance. If you could unspool time, would you? He considered. The man who had once counted sorrow like rosary beads now counted blessings with the same devotion. "You asked if I had regrets," he said at last, eyes crinkling as he turned to her. "Only one that I didn't find my way here sooner." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the old porch wrapped around them like a familiar song. "You came when I was ready to believe in someone again," she said, "which is exactly when I needed you." They fell into a companionable silence, the kind that belongs to people who have earned it in dust and laughter, in blood and music, in the careful daily choice to stay. Somewhere beyond the fence, a calf bawled and was answered. In the big pasture, Midnight lifted his head as if catching a note of harmonica on a wind that didn't actually carry one, and then went back to grazing content. A ranch, a love, a herd, all of it remade, not by conquest, but by the gentler, tougher work of trust. And as the stars came on one by one, the land held them two people who had been broken and were no longer a horse, who had refused to be a place that turned spectacle into sanctuary together, exactly where they were always meant to be.
Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us.